ladies to be able to introduce our speaker. But I think it's really one of the examples of what biblical scholarship and ancient Jewish studies should be like. Professor Tammi Schneider teaches at Claremont Graduate University. She's a graduate of University of Pennsylvania in their Ancient History program. She's the kind of Renaissance scholar that can do all kinds of things, and I think that some of the richness of her scholarship is a reflection of the breadth of her scholarship. For example, I worked with her many, many years ago on a survey of excavation. She's really a fantastic archaeologist. She worked at the excavations of Tel Akko, or Biblical Ekron, for many years. She's the co-director of the excavations now at Tel Akko in Israel. She's been working there for many years. She's also she's also written on ancient Mesopotamian history. She has a book called An Introduction to Ancient Mesopotamian Religion. And in addition to this, she has several books dealing with various aspects of feminist biblical criticism. Her books include Sarah, the Mother of Nations, Judges, in the Berit Olam series, and Mothers of Promised Women in the Book of Genesis. And her current research is a book on peripheral men in the Book of Genesis, and she's also editing a volume on Mesopotamia and the Bible. So it's really rare that you find scholars that have this kind of breadth of scholarship. And I think we're really fortunate to have Professor Schneider here today. Her talk today is Through the Feminine Gaze, Ancillary Men in the Book of Genesis. Professor Schneider, you have your space.
So it's always weird when you get a nice introduction, especially from someone who you've known since way back when, because then the expectations are high. So I hope I don't disappoint. And what I'm talking about today is a book that I haven't written yet, so I'm kind of excited to sort of trot it out and see where we go. Terah worships idols. Lot sleeps with his daughters. Ishmael is wild. Esau sells his birthright, and Laban cheats Jacob. It appears that the ancillary men are fairly horrible. Yet is this a fair assessment? Investigating the ancillary men in Genesis is the focus of my new project and of my talk today. The project grows out of my study on women in the book of Genesis. The women in Genesis have had a bad name, or they did until I addressed it, and it was clear that women are more prominent in that book than previous scholarship suggests. If the women are more important than previously considered, maybe the same methodology would work for men in Genesis. The list, I wasn't quite as invested in these ancillary men, but I still wanted to give them a chance. The initial list of characters suggests a completely different set of issues than with the women, since women, as a trope, play a specific role and function in different biblical books. Because men are so prevalent and there are so many more of them, my assumption was that they do not fulfill one role or function, but are the basis of the entire enterprise. That thesis is wrong, but at least I figured it out before I wrote the book. Examining men in the book of Genesis reveals that the text is about the patriarchs. Modern biblical scholarship suggests the other men highlight how good the patriarchs are. The Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible does not. In other words, while it is the case that the book of Genesis is all about the patriarchs and Joseph, and I know he's not a patriarch, but we're just grouping him with the patriarchs today, just stick with me. It is not the case that all of the supporting male characters show how great the patriarchs are, and many supporting actors are not bad, nor are the patriarchs always good. In order to prove the point of my new book that is not yet written, I'm going to provide you with an overview of what the goal and parameters are of the project, my methodology, show how the list of character raises a number of issues just by the lists themselves, and then provide two short examples of how the methodology works, which I think prove my point. My new project examines all the men in the book of Genesis who are the subject of at least one singular verb, except for the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. There is so much more text devoted to them that including them would not allow a thorough examination of these ancillary characters, which is my point. Each male character, who is the singular subject of at least one verb, will be examined by what I call verbing the character. The goal of this approach is to try to quantify clearly qualitative data. The approach examines each character from 4 perspectives: their description, where they are the subject of the verb, where they are the object of a verb or a prepositional phrase, and their relationships. What constitutes a description is not just an adjective, but includes nouns applied to the character. The Hebrew language does not have a large class of adjectives, and nouns, especially kinship terms, define and describe characters. Since all of the characters are embedded in a literary text, just because a character is the subject of a verb does not necessarily mean they are in charge of an action or a situation. I will now present an overview of some of my lists and numbers. I love counting. Verbs, adjectives, how many characters there are, whatever. How many times they appear. What counting does is provide hard data that can confirm or deny assumptions. Okay, so 77 men are the subject of at least one verb in the book of Genesis. One of the first things I had to do was group these people, and some of these have to be nuanced. Some of them aren't named, and so I had to come up with my own little monikers for them, but there's your list. And some of them probably none of you even recognize. So, but they're there, I promise you. So 77 men are the subject of at least one verb in Genesis. One of the things I had to do first was to group these people. In the book on women, they kind of naturally fell into categories that were matriarchs, potential matriarchs, women before the promise, and other women. And even those categories seem to suggest that the patriarchs are the point of that book. The categories that jumped out here, including how many times each of these characters is referenced and in how many chapters, just because I wanted to count more things, are, drum roll, men before the patriarchs, right? So these are the individuals who predate the patriarchs. Then we have relatives of the patriarchs. This is relatives of them, but not their descendants, which falls into a different category. Descendants of patriarchs and listmen, and these are the people who bore blah, right? And so they're just in a list, they don't do very much, but ironically enough, they are the subject of a verb, where some other kind of important people actually are not. And listmen who are descendants of Esau and Ishmael, because both of them have what they call a toldot, which is a family tree of sorts, right, where they list their descendants going out a number of generations, but I don't like to translate it, so I'm going to call it a toldot. And so you have listmen who are in those lists, but are descendants of patriarchs, so they are slightly different than just your average listman. And then foreign people of power, and here I separated the Abimelechs. I'm on the fence about whether or not I'm going to keep it that way, and I have categorically separated the Pharaoh who engages with Abraham from the Pharaoh who knows Joseph. And then other people. And ironically enough, the list of other people is fairly extensive, and they're in weird places. I was surprised that there were so many of them. All right, so 2 initial findings surprised me. Of Jacob's 12 sons, only 5 are the subject of their own verb at least once. Joseph, Reuben, Judah, Shimon, and Benjamin. In Jacob's blessing, they do things in a theoretical future, but they don't actually do them, and so those don't count in my methodological approach, let's call it. Despite the numerous references to the 12 sons of Jacob, or the 12 sons of Israel, or however you're constructing that category, more than half of them never do anything on their own, and only function as part of a group. Noah's son Ham is the subject of verbs, and Shem is the subject of a verb once in a list, and Japhet is never the subject of a verb. So again, some of these sort of key players that one might have expected to show up aren't there. On the other side, the top 5 characters referenced were unexpected, at least by me. Aside from the patriarchs and Joseph, the most active character is Laban, referenced 91 times in 10 different chapters. Esau is referenced 87 times in 8 chapters, and shortly behind Esau is the Pharaoh who knows Joseph, referenced 73 times over 8 different chapters. Noah is referenced 65 times in 6 chapters, and 5th is Abraham's servant, referenced 52 times, but he only appears in 1 chapter. Again, not sure what all of these numbers mean, but if I had sat down and thought it out, I wouldn't have come up necessarily with all those 5 as sort of the top players in the book. On the other side, now I will provide 2 men using my approach. I had difficulty deciding who to present. Originally, I was going to present a son of each patriarch, but Esau and Ishmael were too big. So I will do 2 who surprised me, one who does more than I expected, and one less. I will begin with Abraham's brother Haran, and then turn to Ishmael. Is that too small?
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. I don't know how to make it clear. Anyway, it's just a family tree of Terah, because everything kind of really goes back to him, not so much Abraham, which is something that I'm going to deal with. And it just breaks down the family tree. There was one that was a little bit bigger and easier to situate, but it said on it the family of Jesus on it, even though it was just Terah through Jacob's children. And I thought, coming into a Jewish studies event, maybe that wasn't the right slide to show. So anyway, it was just to ground you into who these characters are, and I don't know how to make it bigger. I'm not a tech whiz, so sorry about that. All right, so Haran. Haran is Abram's brother. Haran dies before Abram's name changes to Abraham, so I'm going to keep referring to Abraham as Avram there. Dictionary entries of him, and what I'm going to do is for each character, I will summarize standard biblical judgment on the character, review how they are described, where and how they are the subject and object, discuss the relationships, and end by summarizing if and how the image presented by the data aligns with mainstream biblical scholarship about who and what they are. All right, so Haran is Abram's brother. I'm gonna keep calling him Abram here. Dictionary entries of him simply reference his relationships. Note his name should be differentiated from the place where the family moves. And note that he dies before his father Terah, which is not a bad summary. Technically, he is not a list man, but Haran functions that way, I argue, to explain why Lot, Haran's son, appears in so much text. Haran is described once, and his main actions are bearing and dying. Thus, his role appears to be an explanation for something that will happen in Avram's story. Haran is not named, but referenced using a descriptor once. When Avram takes Lot with him to Canaan, following the deity's promise, and I don't refer to God because everybody has their own notion of who and what that is, so I refer to the Israelite deity if I am referring to the Tetragrammaton Yud-He-Vav-He, and if I am referring to Elohim, I will say Elohim. Just they're different names for the deity in my view of the world. Haran is described this one time, and his role appears to be an explanation for what happens to Avram. When Avram takes Lot with him to Canaan following the deity's promise is the first time that Haran is described. Lot is described as the son of his brother. This is the first reference to Lot in Genesis 12, the chapter when Avram receives his call to go to the land the deity will show him. The deity tells Avram to leave his father's house in Genesis 12:1, and this reference suggests Lot is not part of Avram's father's house, but his brother's, possibly justifying taking him to Canaan, right? This is one of the problems is, should Lot have ever been allowed to go with Avram in the first place? Haran is a subject twice. Haran bears Lot in Genesis 11:27, and neither Avram nor Nahor, Neither Avram nor Nahor, Avram's brother, father's sons until later in the story, or at least it is not announced. The reference here explains Lot's high profile in the rest of the story, which is linked to Haran's second verb. He dies in Genesis 11:28. Haran is dead, but he has a son, which builds tension through much of Avram's story, because how will Avram inherit the deity's promise when he is childless, and his promise is to offspring that he does not yet have? That's an issue. The prominence of Lot, whose only importance is he is Haran's son, seemingly suggests he is a lineage option for Avram. Haran appears as an object 3 times, twice as the son of Terah in Genesis 11:26, and once when Terah takes Lot, the son of Haran, with him to go to Canaan. Despite a limited number of references, Haran has many relationships. Since Haran dies, his son Lot, the only male descendant of any of Terah's sons, is taken care of by both Terah and Avram. Terah takes Lot with him when he moves with Avram to Canaan, and stays with him when he stops and stays in Padan Aram. Avram has a relationship with Haran because he is his brother and because Lot, Haran's son, travels with him. Since Avram and Sarah do not have a child until much later in the story, for many chapters, Lot appears a likely inheritor if not the deity's promise, at least their stuff. Avram's brother is about Avram. Haran is known for 2 major issues. He has a son and he dies. Since Nahor's line merges with Avram's, Nahor's descendant is Rebecca, so his line merges with Avram's. At issue for much of the story is, will Lot, Haran's descendant, be included in the future of Terah's line? Highlighting how odd the distribution of characters who are subjects of verbs are in Genesis, Haran's brother Nahor appears more often, 10 times. His descendants merge with Abraham's to inherit the promise through Rebecca, and he is never the singular subject of a verb. Ishmael, so that's my first one, and he's a tad more important than I expected. Ishmael is Abram's oldest son. Despite what should be his prominent position, because he is not the one named to inherit the promise for his generation, not much space is devoted to him in the text. Scholars focus on issues surrounding his mother, Hagar, his mother's relationship with Abraham's wife, Sarah, and the relationship his descendants have to Israel. Verbing Ishmael reveals a docile character, rarely doing anything, who functions primarily as an object to move along others' stories. In most treatments of Genesis, the character of Ishmael is meaningless, and the focus is what happens to those considered his descendants, understood as modern Bedouins. At issue is whether being a Bedouin is a good thing or a bad thing. Thus, Bill Arnold claims, quote, Ishmael will be his own man, a freedom-loving nomad, independent of the rest of Avram's descendants and free to chart his own course, end quote. The argument of most appears to be that in contrast to his mother, Ishmael will be free. Ishmael described 5 different ways, beginning even before his birth. He is a son, circumcised, a child, a na'ar, and a bowman. While many of these descriptions are not particularly unusual, the order in which they are applied to Ishmael and his initial introduction heavily influence how he is treated in the history of scholarship. Ishmael is first described as a son in Genesis 16:11, when the messenger of the deity notes Hagar is pregnant and will bear a son who will be named Ishmael. Still in the same chapter, the text notes Hagar bore to Abraham a son, and Abraham named the son who Hagar bore Ishmael. In Genesis 17, when the deity commands circumcision, Abraham takes his son to be the first one in line. In Genesis 21, Ishmael is described as a son 4 times, and each time it is pitched slightly differently depending on the speaker. The narrator refers to him as, quote, the son of Hagar who she bore to Abraham in Genesis 21:9. In the next verse, Sarah, Abraham's wife, tells him to exile, quote, this slave and her son, because the son of this slave will not inherit with Isaac, end quote. In the next verse, Abraham contemplates Sarah's words, upset because it concerned a son of his, presumably Ishmael, but the text does not state categorically which son is upsetting Abraham. So it could be either Isaac or Ishmael. To comfort Abraham, Elohim renews the promise to make the son of a slave a great nation because he is Abraham's seed. Both Ishmael and Isaac together are named his sons when they bury their father in Genesis 25:9. Finally, Ishmael is labeled the son of Abraham after Abraham's death when introducing Ishmael's Toldot. While Ishmael is labeled a son multiple times, Abraham never uses that terminology. Abraham's biological connection to Ishmael is named by the narrator repeatedly, but usually in reference to Ishmael's mother, Hagar. Both Sarah and Elohim emphasize he is the son of a slave. The text notes Abraham's later children are sent off with presents before he dies, noting Isaac inherits everything, and it is not clear where Ishmael fits into the scheme. Despite everything, Ishmael buries Abraham with his half-brother, Isaac. Unlike Abraham's other descendants, Ishmael's descendants are listed in an official Toldot, right? So their family line gets its own place. Ishmael's description in Genesis 16:12 hinges on the translation of a number of terms. The New Jewish Publication Society translates, quote, "He shall be a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He shall dwell alongside of all of his kinsmen," end quote. NRSV suggests he shall live at odds with all of his kin. And at issue, clearly, is how one translates, especially the words in the second half of the verse. Another translation, possibly offered by me, could be, "His hand in all, and the hand of all in him, and upon the face of all his brethren he will dwell," end quote. The fundamental question is, will Ishmael live next to his kin in peace, or will it be confrontational? The reference occurs before Ishmael is born, and scholars use this to define how he should be viewed. Ishmael is also circumcised in Genesis 17:23, 25, and 26. What this means for Ishmael is important. Abraham wants Ishmael to look like him and be included in the covenant. This reference to Abraham and Ishmael being circumcised is in the same verse, Genesis 17:26, while the rest of the household is circumcised in the next verse, 27. Ishmael was referred to as a child, Gelad actually in this one, in a story following the reference to his being 13, right? So this happens after he's 13 when he is circumcised, after Isaac's weaning party, which is after his circumcision, right? Because only there is Isaac's birth even talked about, and it hasn't been consummated yet. On the morning Ishmael and his mother Hagar are exiled by Abraham and Sarah, and when the water runs out and his mother sets him under a bush, and when she moves away so she does not see his death, that he is described this way. Despite creating a more sympathetic Ishmael, the image is not consistent throughout the episode. A few verses after Ishmael is identified as a child, he is then labeled a Na'ar. And he's called this in Genesis 21:12, 17, 18, and 19. Which can mean a young man or a male outside the protection of the father's house, or there's a whole big conversation about what this term means. Carol Lieb argues that during Ishmael's early years, he is described as Abraham's son, but as his disenfranchisement approaches, he is named differently. The deity refers to Ishmael as Na'ar at the very moment the deity saves Ishmael in the desert. Ishmael grows into his next description, a bowman. He is the only person so labeled in the Hebrew Bible. There are bows and archers elsewhere, but no one else is a bowman. Ironically, many of Ishmael's descriptions, the descriptors, son of Hagar, Abraham, and of a slave, child, Na'ar, and bowman, occur in chapter 21 of Genesis, where he is never actually named, right? He is only referenced, he is never named in that entire chapter. Ishmael's descriptions suggest he is a son, a child, a young man outside the protection of his father's house, and a bowman. The future predicted by the deity's messengers may come true in Ishmael's lifetime, depending on how one translates and understands wildness and the relationship between Ishmael and those around him. Ishmael is rarely the subject of a verb. With the exception of one verb, most of Ishmael's actions are almost passive. The verb which is the most active is also the most problematic in terms of understanding what he does and how that impacts his story. Ishmael is first the subject of a verb at Isaac's wedding feast, where Sarah sees him in Genesis 21:9. Since he is not named in this chapter, he is identified as the son of Hagar, who she had borne to Abraham. His action is plain, mitzachet. Since this leads to banishment, understanding how to understand this verb is important. The verb means to play and is the same root for Isaac's name. It could mean everything from children playing together to sexual assault. While there are those who suggest sexual assault is not possible and is taking it too far, the problem is the next time the verb appears, Isaac is doing this very same thing to Rebekah and lets Abimelech know that they're married. So, presumably, he's doing something with her. Do with that what you will. Whatever it is that Sarah sees is enough to convince Elohim, who convinces Abraham to banish both mother and son. Ishmael is not a subject again until the end of the chapter, when the text notes Elohim is with the Na'ar, and he grew and dwelled in the wilderness, where he becomes a bowman. These verbs remind the reader that Ishmael survives and lives in the wilderness, precisely where he and his mother are sent. The next time Ishmael is a subject of a verb, he is with his brother, Isaac. Both Isaac and Ishmael bury Abraham. With Ishmael's final verb, he dies. Genesis 25:17 notes he breathed his last and died and was buried, gathered to his kin. This note appears at the end of the Toldot of Ishmael. Ironically, Ishmael, who is predestined to be wild, plays a passive role in the text. With the exception of the verb concerning Isaac, all he does is grow, bury his father, and die. References to him as an object reinforce this picture. Ishmael is an object more than he is a subject of a verb or described combined, and many of the times he is described mark him as an object. Where he is an object, cluster around his being the son of Hagar, who she bears to Abraham, his father's advocacy for him, his circumcision in Genesis 17, the banishment incident, and having descendants. Ishmael is introduced before he is born, and his mother Hagar is told to name him Ishmael. The text repeats 4 different times that he is the son Hagar bore to Abraham. Ishmael's parentage is a significant factor in his identity, noted before he is born, when he is born, and at his death. The point of Ishmael appears to describe patriarchs Abraham and, to some extent, Isaac. Abraham's fondness for Ishmael is apparent when he is told he will have another child who will inherit the deity's promise in Genesis 17. Abraham's response to hearing he will have a child with Sarah is to fall down on his face, laughing, and suggest, quote, "Let Ishmael live before you," end quote. When Abraham is offered another son, other than thank the deity, he advocates for the one he already has. The deity responds that the deity will bless him, referring to Ishmael, and multiply him, and he will bear 12 tribes and will be a great nation. Yet in the very next verse reiterates that the promise will be with Isaac. The deity understands Abraham's affection for Ishmael and will act on that, but makes clear Ishmael's success is only for Abraham's sake. Still in Genesis 17, the deity requires circumcision for Abraham and his entire household as a sign of the covenant. While Ishmael is the object here, it is clear, especially after Abraham's advocacy for him in the previous lines, that this is Abraham's attempt to keep Ishmael in the covenant. Ishmael is repeatedly an object without being named throughout Genesis 21. Following Isaac's weaning festival, and in the desert when he and his mother almost die, Ishmael is such an object that his mother, now free also, is the one who finds him a wife from the land of Egypt. So she actually is the one who finds him a wife, not him. She's one of the few mothers in the history of the universe who gets to do that. Ishmael as an object is an object even in his own family tree. The final verse summarizing his life is the only place that aligns with what the messenger of the deity says will happen. They camped alongside all their kinsmen. Thus, the summary of Ishmael's life has the messenger's line coming true, though there is nothing about how Ishmael is described or what he does that suggests that alignment. Finally, Ishmael is an object when the text references his daughter as she is the daughter of Ishmael. In both cases, it seems like he has two. The point appears to be that Esau is confused how many daughters he has. He seems to have a daughter and she has a sister, so presumably he has two, but mostly it's talked about when Esau marries one of his daughters. So, in this case, the point appears to be that Esau is trying to please his parents or his father by not marrying a non-Canaanite woman as his brother Jacob was instructed. So there's that whole case where Isaac and Rebekah are upset about Esau's wives, and they send Jacob off to marry a nice girl from Padan Aram, and so then Esau turns to Uncle Ishmael's daughter and marries her, thinking that that will be a non-Canaanite option. Thus, the places where Ishmael is an object align with everything else suggested about him. He is the oldest son, but not by the right mother. His father cares about him and advocates for him, but doesn't do so that much or consistently. Since Ishmael carries out so few actions, the bulk of his relationships is based on how others treat and view him. Ishmael's mother is only depicted when she is with him or doing something for him. We know nothing about how Ishmael thinks or feels about her. Abraham's relationship with Ishmael is complex. When Abraham learns about the son Sarah will hear, Abraham mentions Ishmael. Abraham ensures Ishmael stays in the covenant by circumcising him immediately. Ishmael is upset when Sarah tells him to banish his slave and her son. After Elohim tells Abraham not to be upset about his son since he will become a nation, Abraham goes along with the banishment. No text suggests Abraham knows what happens to Ishmael and Hagar at the end of chapter 21. In the following chapter, when Elohim has Abraham take Isaac to Mount Moriah, presumably to sacrifice him, Isaac is referred to as his only son. The reader knows this is not accurate, but is not clear if Abraham does. Thus, Abraham appears to care about Ishmael, but not enough to go out of his way for him. The only comment on Ishmael's attitude towards Abraham is that he buries him with his brother, Isaac. Sarah and Ishmael do not have a good relationship. Sarah has issues with Hagar, Ishmael's mother. Sarah originally wants Hagar's son to be considered hers, probably similar to Leah and Rachel's situation later. That idea falls apart as soon as Hagar becomes pregnant. What Sarah's relationship with Ishmael is between his birth until Isaac is weaned is unclear. What is clear is that at Isaac's weaning party, something breaks. Sarah demands Abraham exile Hagar and her son. That action frees Hagar and her son. If the interpretation of Ishmael as a wild ass means he is free, ironically, Sarah's action causes the messenger's prediction to come true. It is not clear what Ishmael and Isaac's relationship is. At Isaac's weaning festival, they are playing. Both sons' lives are put at risk by Abraham, who follows his deity's instructions. Neither son is depicted being with Abraham following those incidents until he dies. When Esau seeks a wife to please his parents, he marries the daughter of Ishmael, his uncle. Ishmael's relationship with the deity is complicated. The deity announces Ishmael's birth to his mother and lets her know of his future. When Abraham advocates for Ishmael, the deity grants him a great future, but because of Abraham, not because of himself. When Sarah suggests Abraham banish Hagar and Ishmael, Elohim supports her. Elohim saves the Na'ar, but only when Hagar is desperate and sure he will die. Elohim is with him as he grew. After that, there is no connection between the Israelite deity and Ishmael. Thus, it appears the deity takes care of Ishmael only because of Abraham. Ishmael is an object in a complex set of family dynamics. The general outlines of his character are simple and depict a character who is an object. He is the only child of a single mother, and she suffers greatly to have him and protect him. His father likes him, but not that much. The Israelite deity decides that another son of Abraham's from a different mother will inherit the covenant. Abraham, who in other places is more than happy to advocate for others against the deity, decides this is not the hill he wants to die on. This is not the place to do that, and acquiesces to Sarah's demands, supported by Elohim, to exile Ishmael. Ishmael has some relationship with his brother Isaac. What these two cases show is that Abraham is the center of both of these characters. Without them, they do not exist. The question is, do they highlight Abraham in a good light or a bad light? I argue Haran makes Abraham look neither good nor bad. He raises the issue that he can bear sons when Avram cannot, or not yet. Haran's son Lot takes center stage for a significant period of time, not because of anything about Lot, but because of Haran's death. As such, his role is neutral in the assessment of Avram. He does not help or hinder, but is more of a vehicle to raise other issues. Will Avram continue to serve the deity when his reward is offspring he does not have? Ishmael is more complex from my gaze, that's the feminist gaze that we're using here today, and makes Abraham appear less impressive. Abraham is happy to do Sarah's wishes when she requests he sleep with Hagar and have children through her. When Sarah and Hagar's relationship disintegrates, he is quick to throw up his hands and say, "You deal with it." He appears to care about Ishmael because when he learns he will have another child by Sarah, he does not believe it can happen, is not interested, and advocates for Ishmael. When circumcision is demanded, Abraham makes sure Ishmael is immediately after him in line to be in the covenant. Once Isaac is born, Abraham becomes less involved. He does not advocate for Ishmael, but feels bad. He listens to both the deity and Sarah and banishes both Hagar and Ishmael. Despite no text referencing them meeting again, when Abraham returns from not sacrificing Isaac, he spends his time in Beersheba, quite possibly where the text suggests Hagar and Ishmael went after their trial in the desert. My book is not yet finished, but each of the ancillary men raised troubling questions. When I examined the women, clear themes emerged. It is less likely that such themes will emerge here, but each character study raises significant questions about the ancillary men in the text that offers some insight into a book where they have been ignored for too long. Thank you.
I think we have time for some questions. I'll let you deal with the questions.
Okay.
Thank you
So you're, if I'm hearing correctly, that the women fit into clearer categories?
Yes.
Why do you think that is the case?
So because even in medical science in the 20th century, the standard body is a male body, right? There are more of them in the text, and they're more the standard thing, whereas women are often used in other books as a trope, right? So it's not them that matters, but it's them as a woman, right? So you see that in Genesis, in my Women in Genesis book, I argue that the women are the ones who actually decide who inherits the deity's promise, right? Because it's the women who have a relationship with the deity that their kids make it, and all of the patriarchs have more than one child. And when you look at the other women, they all seem to be, women are clearly more important in Genesis as mothers than as wives, right? So their role as wives in Genesis doesn't seem important, but they're out there as mothers, and most of them fall into a mothering category, and there are very few exceptions to that. In the book of Judges, you have a totally different situation. And there, I argue that women are used almost as a barometer of what's happening in society, and society is on a downward spiral. So the women at the beginning are sort of strong, independent, and alive, and by the end, they're gang raped to death, right? So there they serve, clear purposes, right? That isn't so much about the character as much as it is about women as trope. That's not the case with, I didn't think that was going to be the case with the men, and I'm not convinced it totally is, but they are clearly, I haven't dealt with the ones pre-Terra thoroughly yet, but I think they're there to get us to Abraham, truth be told. But all of them are there only because about the patriarchs and then supporting roles, right? They're the main characters, and then what happens to them along the way and how they deal with it and how that reflects upon them, I think is what the other guys are doing. And so that's why it's not quite the same as with women. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay, yeah. There were some other hands? Yes?
Thank you for the talk. I was just wondering if you've taken into account how many certainly when we're dealing with the brother pairings, how much the ancillary brother gives to the character, to defining the character of the patriarchal or the central brother, and then of course, Lot steps in as a brother because Abraham is not around his brothers, and Laban steps in as a kind of a brother figure, etc. But the point is, they're really important.
Absolutely.
But perhaps not grammatically in terms of subject, verb, object.
Well, so that was one of the things that was so shocking for me diving into this, right? So in the women book, right, so one of the reasons why I started this methodology is, so I got tired of people saying, well, so-and-so is a weak character and so-and-so is a strong character without any basis for analysis. So I thought, well, there are data in the text, right? There are verbs and there are descriptors and there are places where people are subject, right? So let me quantify that, because that way I have data, right? I love data, right? I'm a data girl, right? Even though I do humanities, right? But you can say categorically, so-and-so is a subject more often than they are an object, right? Rebecca, she's out there doing stuff all the time, and even when she is the object of something, most of the time it's because of something she put into place and, is coming home to roost, and it's usually benefiting her, right? And so that's why I did that with the men. And so my initial shock was that Jacob's sons, who are so important, right? The 12 tribes, the 12 brothers, the 12, right? This basis, this foundational component for the rest of, the book until, 10 of them get exiled, right? Way later, right? Don't actually do anything in Genesis as character, right? Which means that the brothers are actually functioning as a trope, more so than as characters. Not what I was expecting, right? And the brothers that do things, like Judah, right, is a big deal. Benjamin, ironically enough, is treated, he's always treated as a child. He, the only thing he does is he cries, and he is, and because everybody has to protect Benjamin, right? That's how his character kind of develops, which is really interesting when you compare it to, say, how the tribe of Benjamin functions in, say, the Book of Judges, and of course when you look historically after. During the Babylonian exile, right, so you've got the 10 tribes that are gone. The tribe of Shimon gets kind of absorbed by Judah, so it sort of disappears. Tribe of Levi, some will argue that they still exist today, with people with certain last names, though I doubt that, but our professor of Jewish studies can weigh in on that more than I. And then you've got, and then the tribe of Judah is exiled to Babylon, where we meet them and see them again when they come back through Ezra and Nehemiah. But the physical, the tribe of Benjamin, where the remnant of Benjamin lives, is the only place that isn't actually physically demolished by the Neo-Babylonians. So they kind of survive, and then you hear about Benjamin in the book of Esther, right? So Esther is a descendant, Mordecai is a Benjaminite. And so you would think, yes, it makes sense that Benjamin and Judah are two of the movers, two of the people who actually do stuff in Genesis, but it was interesting to me that there wasn't consistency in terms of what happens to those tribes later on and how their characters are pitched in Genesis. And so I think the trope of the brother is hugely important. And it's clearly something that manifests itself not by them doing actions, but they sort of brothers sort of march around in groups, similar even to Noah's sons, right? So of the three, one of them does a few things. One of them really is just a list man. Shem is, he's a begetter, but he doesn't do much more than that. And Japheth he's not the subject of a verb, right? So these brotherly groups that we think of as important, I think are more important as groups, not as individuals in that group. Does that make sense?
I understand, yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I'm finding out. I'm still, again, I haven't written the book yet. I've written a bunch of the chapters, and then I have to write them all, and then I have to sew them together and rewrite it all. So this is my opening foray into this. Yeah.
So you're presenting your work as a re-examination of these figures from a feminist or your point of view.
Yes.
Have you had any interest in trying to examine the Quranic versions of these biblical stories, how the descriptives and verbs? Number two, different, is there any chance that the earliest forms of Hebrew, those verbs had a different meaning that are not always easy to be certain about comparing to later biblical Hebrew?
Okay, so the first one, so one of my big, huge new fascinations, we talked a little bit about this at lunch, is how stories get translated and brought into other traditions. And so I'm actually at the Society of Biblical Literature. I'm starting a new group. We just got a blessing to start it on comparative, right? So what's the methodology for comparing things? And how do we develop a methodology that is kind of what I would argue ethical, right? And so one of the problems with comparing, in particular, Ishmael to the Quran is that the role that Ishmael plays in Islam is different than what it is in the Hebrew Bible. The texts, and people talk about the sacrifice of Isaac. The Quran does not name which son it is. It is, everyone says that, it's Ishmael in the Quran. It's not, right? And that is later interpretations, and even the Prophet Muhammad was told that it was probably Isaac, and then it was later that it was changed to Ishmael. So that's one that gets really very complicated. But to compare, on some levels, it's a comparison of apples and oranges, right? So in the Muslim tradition, the Quran has an important role that is not identical to the role that the Hebrew Bible plays in Judaism, nor is it the same as the Old Testament plays in Christianity, right? So to compare those characters across different traditions means that you can't just look at how they appear in those other texts, but you have to look at what is the expectation of the group that has received those texts. How do they understand that text and therefore the characters in that text, and only then do a comparison, right? Because otherwise you're taking whatever, if you're a Muslim and looking at the Hebrew Bible, you're coming at it with a really different set of expectations about both what the text should say and why it might be different than what is in your text, right? And so as a scholar who happens to be Jewish but likes to view herself as, working with a, scholarly academic paradigm, right? You really have to understand what that text is and how it's functioning before you start comparing it, and you have to be careful in that comparative journey. And then the second question, wait, I've forgotten it.
Well, I think Ron Hendel, when he talks about
Yeah.
who wrote the Bible and when, uses different definitions of biblical words.
Correct.
As early or late, even though they may be the same word.
Right. So I don't spend a lot of time trying to decide when the Bible was written, redacted, and whatever. That is not an interest of mine, and we can talk about that later or not. But I was trained in the tablet room where we were writing the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary. And I know that the way you figure out what a word means is you lift up all the references to it and you throw them out on the table and you say, well, how does this word appear? And how does this, and then you break it down and you say, well, in these contexts it appears this way, in this context it appears this way, etc. So I, before I do a deep dive and tell you what a word means, chances are high that I will lift up every reference to that term in the biblical text and then look at how it functions. And then look and see if it is used differently in certain books than other books. Look and see if it is used certain ways in some contexts and not in others. So I do pay attention to how terms are used pretty carefully. Probably in a slightly different way than my colleague Dr. Hendel does, but I certainly do look at that. The concordance is my friend, and so are grad students, who often go and do my dirty work or get obsessed with it themselves. Yeah, and so I take a very, how does this word appear, where does it appear, before I dive in, and that's why what Isaac is doing, it says, oh, it can't be sex. But the very next time the word appears, that's what it means. Do with that what you will. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
So, Abraham had no children.
Yes.
With Keturah or
Yes.
what that seems to be her. Why are they never married again? Or they're gone? It's just one time and that's it?
Yeah, the question was, Abraham has other children with Keturah and some other women later on, and we never hear about them. What about them? Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So again, the book is about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, just because there's so much text, although I don't know what we think about Joseph. Joseph makes my brain explode, so the goal is to do this book, then to do one on Abraham, then to do one on Isaac, then to do one on Jacob, and then to do Joseph. So, and then I'm retiring. So, or I'll probably be retired by the time I get to Joseph. So the deity is giving the promise to Isaac. The deity actually is an advocate of Sarah. Abraham does what he's supposed to. He gets Isaac born, keeps him alive for long enough, gets him married to a non-Canaanite. He's done being patriarch, right? He never really does anything after that. The text doesn't care what he does after that, right? I mean, following chapter, 21, 25, who cares, right? And so it's almost like he got Isaac married and now he can retire and go do whatever he wants. One of the things he apparently wants is to go have a bunch of other kids, but the text is really clear that they get presents and then they're sent away and they're not important and they don't bury him. And that's why Ishmael is so interesting, is he falls into a completely different category. And prior to, all the data show that prior to the announcement of the birth of Isaac, right, and in that episode when Abraham is told, and Abraham's name is changed there, is told that he is going to he's perfectly happy with Ishmael, he's good to go, right? And then stuff changes. And so after that, and he's old then, after he has all these other kids. So, yeah, but I mean, it's amazing because he's like, Abraham, Isaac gets established, we hear about the birth of Rebecca, right? And we hear about the birth of Rebecca immediately before Sarah dies, and then boom, we kind of hear nothing about Abraham after that. It's kind of amazing. Yes?
We know that in ancient times, names were very important.
Correct.
So what is the meaning that Ishmael has the name of God in his name and Isaac doesn't?
Yeah, so, right, and I would argue that names matter in the modern world. I certainly spent a whole lot of time thinking about my kids' names, so let us not say that names no longer matter. In both of those cases, right, the deity is the one who tells them what the name's gonna be, right? They don't self-name those kids. And so in the Ishmael case, one of the things I love about Hagar in chapter 16 is she kind of names God herself. She's like, well, she kind of comes up with this thing. It's pretty sassy of her, right? Who's just been, run away. She's pregnant. She's alone. She's a slave. She's sort of self-banished. She has to go back where she knows she's going to be abused. And she sees something in the desert, and she's like, well, I'll name God all by myself, right? I mean, it's pretty amazing. But she is told what that name is going to be. And so I don't know what to do with that. It is kind of amazing though. Ishmael's just this under the radar character, and he and the other thing I love about it too, right? Because his name is about hearing, right? And in the desert, in 21, Hagar cries out, right? And Elohim hears the boy, right? And so there you have it playing out for you right there. Which is interesting because Hagar is the one who calls out. You don't hear about Ishmael calling out, and the deity doesn't treat her very well. So yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
I'm thinking about how you brought up this idea of advocacy and who's like being advocated for, and it seems as if like it's a complicated. I don't know if I would want to be advocated for by Abraham.
Yeah, not so
all
much.
the time. Have you taken into account like it might be good to be out of Abraham's sight, because what happens to the characters in Abraham's orbit is not always the best thing.
Yeah, so I always say if I had to pick a father, I would go with Isaac, hands down, right? Because I'm gonna be a little safer, right? I would not want Abraham to be my dad. And especially as a female, right? Because when he goes to Egypt, he does not have an exit strategy, right? There is no plan to get Sarah out of there. And I'm not a huge Abraham fan. He and I have issues right now. And sorry. That's why I kind of probably gonna do that book glass right before I die, just so that I don't get bombs in my mailbox. And it's ironic, right? Because Abraham in Genesis 18, right? He goes to bat for Sodom and Gomorrah. 50 good men. No, let's go for 10. No, okay, right? They have this whole thing, right? He does that for a bunch of strangers in a city that we're told way back in chapter 13 that they're already bad, right? Like they're already bad in chapter 13 when Lot decides to go there in the first place, right? Like Sodom's just bad news, right? And there's Abraham advocating for them. And here, they say, yeah, let's kill your son. Okay, sure. Oh yeah, I've only got one left. Yeah, let's go. On my way, right? I mean, it's this weird disconnect, and I know that religious traditions who have received the text and have to think that Abraham is good and have been told that he's good, have to then flip that and go, oh, look at, he's so holy that he will kill his kid, right? Okay, mom, help. Right, there's some midrash, right, Jewish midrash that argue that Sarah dies in the very next chapter, right? When so there's a paragraph in between that talks about the birth of Rebecca, and then Sarah. The first line is, Sarah lived until whatever, right? She dies, and some of the midrash suggests that she saw Abraham leave and knew what he was going to do, and she died, or she heard what he was going to do and she died, or she died of a broken heart, which is a real thing, right? And so right? There are a lot of different ways to read that other than Abraham being so great. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to look. For a while, I'm so glad I came up with ancillary because I was calling him minor man, but then I had these visions of like working in a coal mine. And so ancillary is my new thing, right? That's why I wanted to look at some of these other people, because when you look at the female characters, the patriarchs don't look so great, with possible exception of Isaac, right? Isaac's kind of sweet in his own sort of misguided, traumatized way. But the other one's really not so much, right? And so that's why I was curious to see, okay, let's look at the men. And one of the first ones that I did, and I didn't do it today because I spoke here a number of years ago about Laban and Leah, right? Laban is one of those, when you read the introductions in like, any of these dictionaries of the Bible, Laban is this cheating, conniving, horrible guy, right? And he's really not so bad, right? And so he tricks Jacob, like that's a bad thing. I mean, trick before you are tricked, right? And at the beginning, they say, oh, he just cared because he saw all this gold. And no, actually he hears her and she's talking about it, and of course he's gonna see, gold where she didn't have anything, right? And before she leaves, Abraham's servant wants to take her right away, and he's like, well, no, I have to say goodbye to her. We have to have a party. And they're like, no, we gotta go. And so he says, well, I'm not gonna send her out until I ask her, right? And then later, the reason when he goes after them, and the text says, and Jacob says, well, why are you here, whatever it is. He says, well, I didn't have a chance to say goodbye to my daughters and my grandchildren, right? And it also happens to be the case that they stole his gods, but that's not the reason that he lists first either, right? So again, he's one of these clear characters who, because Abraham or Jacob or Isaac have to be good, these other guys have to be bad, and I'm not convinced that's a fair reading of the text, and I am not convinced that the biblical text was meant for us to blindly lift up some and not question them, right? I think we're supposed to walk away going, what in the world, right? And I am more convinced of that now that I am older, right? Because some of those stories read one way to me when I was younger, they read differently to me when my kids were little, and they read very differently to me, right? I know for a fact that a parent can do something out of the greatest of love and caring for their child and have their kid be furious and offended to their soul by that action, right? So just because, Laban's daughters say, our father has kept us out of the inheritance, doesn't mean he didn't think he was doing them a favor, right? I mean, you've got to read these things. And so one of the things I want to do is just flesh out these characters and not go in with a set of assumptions. Did that answer whatever was initially your question? Okay, yeah.
So, I'm happy you said that, because I've actually always took a liking to Esau.
Yeah, I love Esau, but there's so many of him. I couldn't have picked that.
Yeah, so I'm interested in, maybe it's because I'm an older sibling, but because he is, unlike Ishmael, a very active character, right? So is there any?
Yeah, so Esau's really interesting. Esau's kind of a sweetheart. I have a real sweet spot for Esau. And Jacob's like that little annoying brother who's just like, watching, and Esau's out there like doing stuff, right? And Jacob keeps, whatever. And the part that really breaks my heart the most is, so Jacob runs away, and when he comes back, right, he has the whole wrestling match with whatever that entity is. And then he's gonna meet Esau, and he's assuming that Esau is going to be horrible, right? And Esau's all happy to see him, and they hug and they kiss, and everybody's happy, right? And I think Esau's just happy to, Esau's the one who has every reason to possibly still bear a grudge against Jacob, and he let it go. So then he says, let me accompany you, and it looks like they're gonna go home together, and Jacob's like, no, I got all the animals and the kids and stuff, don't worry, like I'll catch up. And then he goes somewhere totally different, right? Like he just lies to Esau's face. He never intended going anywhere with Esau. He never intended a rapprochement, right? He was just afraid of Esau, and then he just, goes to Shem, right? And he's like, really? To Shem of all places, right? And then, ironically enough, what happens? His daughter gets raped there, right? It wasn't a good move. Maybe you should have gone with your brother Esau, and yet that's never a conversation that one has, right? But Jacob makes a really bad move there, right? Jacob, and then Esau ends up saying, it's not worth it, I'm just gonna move. I am moving out of this town, right? But there's a lot of there for Esau. He's actually, and then this whole notion of, his parents being all upset, and so he's like, well, okay, I won't marry Canaanite, I'll marry Uncle Ishmael's daughter, right? And you never hear really how that plays out with mom and dad.
It's interesting that later Jewish traditions are going to read Esau as the bad guy.
He is the bad guy.
And
But if you look at most of those incidents, especially between Jacob and Esau, and the Esau thing, when you look at, so everybody goes, oh yeah, he's so hungry, foo. Well, if you look at the Hebrew words, right, they're really serious words. Like he's about to collapse from, he's been, he's literally starving to death. They use I can't remember the word off the top of my head. I can't remember my name off my head, but right, it's a really big word suggesting fairly serious harm that's about to come to him. It's not like, I skipped lunch today, can you buy me a burger, right? It's a bit more, at least the terminology that's used is a tad more serious than that. Yeah. No, I love Esau. Yeah.
We have one more question.
Yeah, in Deuteronomy 26, you bring the first fruits to the priest, and then you thank God for letting Jacob get away from Laban. Is that kind of contradictory? The wandering Aramean we say on Passover, and
The wandering Aramean thing, I so don't get it. And this, I get in the Haggadah trying to make Jacob good, right? Because that's late, right? I don't know what to do with that, truth be told. And I'm not a huge Deuteronomy girl, so and I try and stay within one book until I got it figured out, and then I play with my parallels. And since Deuteronomy is so complicated, vis-a-vis its relationship with everything else anyway, because it's a rewriting, or is it a pre-writing, right? I wish I knew more what to do with that. And I haven't written the Jacob book yet, so yeah, I don't know what to do with that. I am sorry, and I think about it, especially at Passover. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much.